With Windows 10 going out of support and lots of systems struggling to run Windows 11, we're going to find out if our cheap £10 gaming PC can be saved and is still usable by going back to Windows 7. Right, so this PC here was originally our £3 computer that came with a fun story about someone's divorce. Also looks like it came from a raffle. We then turned this into a £10 gaming computer using whatever cheap upgrades we were able to find. They included a few parts to the RAM, a new graphics card, a new processor. The computer wasn't very happy. We ended up running the latest version of Windows we could on here, and it worked okay, but it just seemed like the computer had issues. And there were people crying out for a few different options. Half the people wanted an older version of Windows on here, and the other half of people, well, they wanted Linux. So we're probably going to end up doing two videos on this, starting with the Windows option first, to see if we can take our £10 gaming computer and find out if even in 2026, is this still saved by Windows 7? Can't believe I'm saying that, but it is still people's favourite version of Windows. I mean, it's probably my favourite version of Windows as well, so why don't we give it a go, just make sure this turns on, and go from there. Now, I do need to re-add back in the SSD in here. I mean, it's probably still running the exact same operating system on here. This was just an unbranded SSD that doesn't run quite right, but it's the best we were able to do for the money. Other than that, I've not really touched it since we made the video. It was just a bit of a fun thing to round off the Christmas period on, but there's our SSD back in place. And the one thing I do remember is this computer was absolutely painfully loud all of the time. So we're just going to accept that's what it's going to be like. Let's plug in a monitor though, just double check it still boots up and does something. I don't think we did put Linux on here. I think the original version of the PC we ran Linux on, not since we upgraded it, so that is coming in a future video if people really want to see it. But it was a pretty even split of people asking for either Windows 7 or Linux. And then of course there was a minority of people asking for Windows XP, and an even smaller amount of people asking for Windows Vista. Fortunately, no one asked for Windows Longhorn. We're not doing that just yet. I've spent too long off screen dealing with Longhorn last year. There's probably about 8 hours of footage of me trying to make Windows Longhorn work on a Mac Mini. That may or may not ever become a video. And you know what, this is a test of reliability to see how good the £10 gaming PC was at sitting in a drawer and doing nothing. But I am really curious to see if changing the version of Windows will make any difference. And then maybe we'll try some extras. People did want to see it with an updated BIOS. I did leave a few comments, but then of course, oh, turns on immediately. It was quite speedy. I do remember it being quick to use. I think I'm forgetting how fast it actually was because we're nearly already at Windows. See, with the quad-core processor this is running, it can be funny about the BIOS version we're using. So we will try updating the BIOS. Already the fan in the system is egregiously loud. Yep, this is reminding me of everything. Yeah, this computer is unbelievably loud. So let's see, just a quick recap on the specifications. We were running a cut down version of Windows 11. We had an R7 450 graphics card. It had an Intel Core 2 Quad Q9 400, the unbranded SSD, and we upgraded it to 4 gigs of RAM because that's about the maximum it supports that we can actually find on the market. The other RAM they sent me was actually too good for the price I paid. But the good news is, I have already made off screen, and I've shown it off before in a couple of other videos. In fact, I've sent this ISO to TechWen. This is a fully updated version of Windows 7 with all of the extras required to use in 2025. Well, it's not even 2025 anymore, 2026 now. But this is about as up to date as we can get Windows 7 to be. So we're going to whack this onto the computer and then see if it'll actually work. We can say goodbye to Windows, whatever that was, Windows 11, which, keep in mind, as you saw just then, does work fairly good on this system. There was no issues with it. It's just, this is the best we were able to put together for £10. There are more cheap gaming PCs coming this year, likely with better specifications. But we're going to see if changing the operating system can actually get us any extra performance, and if there's any extras we can do. What is it for boot menu? F12? USB device. System does not, that's the first time it's told us that it hasn't supported the processor. When I did test a different BIOS off screen, it dropped support for this processor entirely because it knows it shouldn't run it, but because it doesn't know what processor it is, it runs it anyway. Whereas the updated ones, of course these were Office machines, they are primarily designed for stability. If you put in a processor that shouldn't work, they would rather it not boot than behave like this, where it's running with a lower multiplier. The fans are constantly on 100%, which is why I'm having to shout over them. In other words, they just did a lot of things to stop you doing this on later BIOS revisions, but we can try them, and we can always roll it back like I've had to. There's still going to be comments of people saying, but you're running a GCN graphics card, this will be saved by Linux. We will see. It's good to get a period-accurate baseline test on Windows, so we can gauge it based on Windows 7, Windows 11, and then finally on Linux. Well, we'll see if that works. It's being a bit weird and only wants to do things that way, but we'll see if it works with a weird hybrid off the hard drive and the SSD, which is what it wants to do. So it's installing some system files on the hard drive, which is dying, and then installing the rest of the files onto the Windows drive, that's also sort of dying. So this could be a complete and utter mistake, depending on how things go. We'll get it installed first, though, and we'll at least see if it boots. So we'll let that run through, let that install, and go from there. I did try and restart the installation, but for some reason this computer wants to be funny and always wants to split the install files between the hard drive and the SSD. Who knows? There's probably no good reason for it, but we're running with that. But we are now actually at the desktop. Oh, it is very speedy to use here. Let's take a little look. First of all, we want to see if we can get a hold of AMD modded drivers. Get those downloading, and then, right, it's BIOS update time. Let's see what this does when we run the program. I love updating my BIOS through programs from the manufacturer's website. Flash access denied. Yep, we got to run as admin, because giving an exe file on a sketchily put together system to flash the BIOS is a great idea. The scariest screen. Now for the moment of truth, does it actually turn back on? Last time it didn't, and I had to put in a new processor. Wait, let's check setup real quick. It is recognizing it as running at 2.5 GHz with the correct multipliers now. Well, this is all very nice. This didn't work. Maybe because I ran it from Windows 11 last time. The very rare Windows 7 is out of support screen. Don't ever tell me again, because I don't care. Right, we need to start installing Steam. Right, let's Steam do this. Steam should just work absolutely fine out of the box. I mean, we are now into 2026, where it really isn't supported, but I don't care. I mean, technically, is this an advantage of Windows 7? That you can actually update the BIOS without it going wrong and killing CPU support and having to manually roll it back? I'm going to call that an advantage of Windows 7. We probably should have done this before we started upgrading this computer, but it's a point in favour of Windows 7. We'll give it that. We'll give it that. Yes, we are now running a 7.5 times multiplier at 2.5 GHz. Already we've got a sizable performance increase from that. Radeon modded drivers. Don't know if these will actually install on Windows 7. Oh, no, it's trying. Let's see, do modded drivers work? A lot of errors. Okay, yeah, something tells me this isn't going to work. Yeah, they aren't actually going to work, but what we'll do is we will run the final drivers from AMD. At least give those a go. Steam can start repairing itself, and then in a couple of minutes time we'll have drivers downloaded. Then we can just go ahead, get MSI Afterburner, see what performance is saying, go from there and see what kind of performance increase we're actually going to get. And then of course later on, probably in a couple of weeks, maybe next week even, we'll put Linux on here and see if that's any better than this. But currently so far, once again, Windows 7 transforms a cheap or old computer. You just have to deal with the fact Microsoft tells you it's out of support. But as multiple people are finding now, because Windows 10's out of support, and everything before it's out of support, you might as well just choose your favourite version and go from there. Because if you're not supported, and you don't want to use Windows 11, does it make any difference to use an older version? Not really, beyond software support and a few other things, but it seems to work fine for me. Steam is also running. I mean, it's actually started downloading something which I wasn't expecting. Usually the download just doesn't work at all whatsoever. And we just wanted to see how much modern stuff we can actually run on here, which is kind of a test of Windows 7, but more importantly, it's for people that are running lower end or cheap systems like this to find out if maybe that this could be a viable option. I mean, let's be honest, at the end of the day, it's difficult to recommend a version of Windows this old, but there is still a lot of a community using Windows 7. I'm fairly sure in the last year or so, Windows 7 usage has gone up purely because people just want to use it. That's the only reason why it's going up, is if you're going to use unsupported Windows, you may as well use one that has very low system requirements, is very speedy, even on a hard drive, so even if you haven't got a sketchy SSD, it's blazing fast, and utilizes very little RAM, which at the moment, with RAM prices going up, kind of a selling point. Not that anyone should really be using just 4 GB, but I suppose if you're doing something like this and building a very basic system, it does mean that 4 gigs does go further. I mean, look there, we just closed Firefox. and we gain nearly a gigabyte of RAM back. Keep in mind that Steam Web Helper is Chrome-based, which is one of the reasons why it does struggle on these newer operating systems. So the fact it is running all of this on top of the driver install, on top of the MSI Afterburner install, on top of even just having Firefox open as well, I have to admit, this is the type of situation where it would begin to struggle on Windows 11. Not majorly, but it is quicker here. I can't fault it. It does make me more curious to see how it's going to hold up when we get to the Linux side of things, but for now, Windows 7's proving pretty good. The issue is going to be compatibility. Steam won't actually let us extend itself to see the close button. Okay, we do have drivers. Do we have software as well? Q9 300, 2.5 GHz, 4 gigs, 800 MHz DDR2. The R7 450 is here. Even working. According to this, even AMD VCE is working. Now it's just get 3D Mark running. Well, the system has locked up all of a sudden. I'm not too sure why. There's a number of reasons why it could be. We just want to be able to launch Steam, open 3D Mark, if not 3D Mark again, make sure we get a baseline reading to see if the system is running better, and then finally get on with the rest of the video and the testing. It's all been going too well. Something had to go wrong. Yeah, I'm not too sure what's going on here because opening Steam is causing the system to lock up. Maybe it's something to do with hardware acceleration kicking in and then it's booting off the card. I mean, maybe we can try another form of hardware acceleration. Steam is very, very iffy to use on Windows 7. Some people swear by it and say it's fine. In my experience, it is exceptionally hit or miss. Like I said earlier, I have never once seen it actually start a download that it wanted to complete until today. And that's in an entire year of on and off using Windows 7. When it launches Steam Web Helper, we'll delete the process and see if that fixes it. I'm just fighting my way through the processes right now. Okay, that has seemingly fixed it. You just have to wrestle with the Steam processes on launch to get it to not crash the entire PC. Let's see if we actually get into 3D Mark and it doesn't lock up the system. I'd really like it to not lock up the system, but if hardware acceleration in Steam is causing it to crash, what is hardware acceleration in an actual benchmark or an actual game gonna do? Well, we can't run Time Spy because we do lose all access to DirectX 12. You need a DirectX 12 compatible operating system. Yeah. There are some ways of running DirectX 12 on Windows 7. Good luck making them work properly. It's going to be an interesting one, because this could just completely lock up the system. We don't know. The only thing they're heating up is the graphics card, which I'm scared to touch because of system stability. So we'll let it get through this benchmark and see what kind of result we get at the end. But there's no point narrating it piece by piece. At least we know it is actually stable and working. So let's get through Firestrike, see what it does, go from there, and legendary! Legendary! Yay! We got a legendary gaming computer. I mean, last time it was rated excellent, I believe, so I will take legendary. CPU is fine. Honestly, it's cooling it A-OK. Yeah, honestly, that's not the worst score in the world. Well, it's still not perfect. I mean, the specifications, nothing here has really changed. We might be able to do a few bits on the GPU clocks and things. And of course, we are running drivers that are a couple of years older than the modified ones. Yeah, we are still running PCI Express 16 times at 1.1 speed, which isn't terrible, but this was a bit of a weird bottleneck for us last time, or at least it seemed like a bit of a weird bottleneck for us last time. I think we're pretty much all ready to go. We know that the system's working, we know that everything's doing okay on Windows 7. Now we've just got to actually go ahead and use the system as we want to actually get it to run. There is one last thing I've got in mind I want to test, which is can we get GTA 5 to work? I would really like it if we could get some degree of modern software support on here, but I don't know how it's going to go, because it's a huge pet peeve of mine, and unfortunately, there's very little you can do to get around it. But let's try again. Now, one of the main issues with running Windows 7 is, of course, program compatibility, as most things that do still work will work absolutely fine, but the moment you run into problems, well, lots has changed in the last few years. Lots of workarounds have stopped working, and originally there was an entire narrated section of me getting GTA 5 to work, because this is one of the most egregious of them all. See, GTA 5 originally launched on Windows 7, and worked absolutely fine. In fact, the game itself still should run. But unfortunately, Rockstar have taken it upon themselves to make it incredibly difficult, patching most workarounds that exist, and leaving those that are still using Windows 7 in a bit of a tough situation. This isn't, of course, the only game that has issues. There's plenty more where the launchers are the problem, and themselves the launchers are the DRM, which mean that games that used to work on the platform have either been patched out maliciously or incompetently left not working. The case of GTA 5, though, it does seem like they're more maliciously trying to get people to move to a newer platform, rather than letting them run the game on the platform they bought it on. So what exactly is the situation? Well, I think GTA 5 is a prime example of one of the issues with Windows 7, where this time it's actually more malicious than it is incompetent. They have deliberately made it so the game will not work here. Despite that Steam is meant to be a DRM in itself, Rockstar uses their own launcher, which is their DRM. The game itself only needs a new version of X input to actually launch on Windows 7, which you can simply add the DLL file in there for, and the game will recognize that it should run. But the thing is, the DRM they use has long since lost support for launching the game on Windows 7, and there's been lots of attempts to work around it for years now, but as we enter 2026, most of these methods no longer work. Until today, where I've now figured out a way of making it work. Now, this was the culmination of just over half a day's effort troubleshooting and trying different ideas. Originally, as I said, it did start off as its completely own narrated section, but it would probably be about 45 minutes to an hour long in itself. So anyway, here's a more condensed down version of how I managed to get GTA 5 to work on Windows 7. Now, on Windows 7 there exists kernel extensions, which let you report a newer version of the operating system than you're actually running, so a program will think it's running on Windows 8, 10 or 11, and it does work for a lot of programs, but you often run into problems. So you'd think the simple answer would be, install the Rockstar launcher using these kernel extensions. But no, that doesn't work. The installer will just crash and run into problems that you can't solve. Installing the Rockstar launcher from a version from 2023 though, then forcing the updater to think it's running on Windows 10, will actually bring you up to the latest version, so that's problem one solved. We've managed to get the Rockstar launcher installed. This though requires the Social Club SDK installed as part of the DRM process, which is likely a leftover from when they got rid of Social Club and made it the Rockstar launcher. Now, of course, this will install, but it will delete itself even if you make the folders it installs into read-only, so then the launcher will never open and your DRM will never be processed. But there is a way to get around this as well. If we install an older version of the game, I was utilizing one from the disc release of the game, and then we put that in the game's directory, when the Rockstar launcher thinks it's finished updating, rather than letting it get rid of all the files and give us an error, we quickly go to the Windows registry, and then of course, because the launcher thinks it's installed these files to the program files folder, we then point it in the direction of the program files where we've actually installed it, which is in the games files. After this, it does seem that it will think it's installed, and this does get the game launching. The only problem is there's now one final hurdle, which is BattlEye. Now, you can get away with launching the game without BattlEye enabled, you just won't be able to access the online portion of the game. So how do we get around this? See, if you try and use the kernel extensions to launch BattlEye, it will quickly realize there's something hooking into it, and given that it is anti-cheat, it won't run. The thing is though, it does appear that you can in turn drop in the files for an older version of BattlEye that will work on Windows 7, and it will launch the game. So it's at least enough for it to approve the check that BattlEye is running, because all the game is looking for is seeing the launcher.exe process for DRM and BattlEye for online. Whether or not this will actually let you stay online long enough to not get banned is another thing. I have tested online and you can go into it. But the thing is, this is a very simplified version of the method. It took a long time to figure all of this out with trial and error, as none of the online methods work, so I was using bits and pieces of another fix, and then making it up as I went along. So, really, you can use this method to get GTA 5 launching on Windows 7, but you're probably better off utilizing a version that doesn't have any of this DRM in the first place. Honestly, it would be a lot easier because then it will just launch. So yes, GTA 5 will work, but through egregious decisions from Rockstar, this is the process you're forced to do to just get it to work. Keep in mind, it used to just work by double-clicking the exe on this platform. So with all of that out of the way, just what are the specifications of this PC? Honestly, if you want to see the progression, after this video I'm probably going to plonk all of the videos on this computer that we do into their own little mini-series, because it's been a fan favourite, and then people can just have a playlist to go through from episode 1 up to whenever we finish this. But we are running an Intel Core 2 Quad Q9300, which is a relatively okay version of the Core 2 Quad, running at 2.5 GHz. It was one of the final releases they did. It's nothing spectacular, it's a relatively low powered chip, but it does have 4 cores. We have the really rather decent R7 450 on board for our graphics. It's one of the AMD rebrandians that just went on and on and on and on, but it is actually an okay graphics card that uses very little power, runs very hot, has plenty of features, and does have 4GB of VRAM, oddly enough. We have 4GB of system RAM because that's the maximum this system can take that we could keep in budget, and it is running with a dying SSD. And that is about all there is to the system. So with all of that out of the way, it's really about time to get round to testing things. See, now this isn't a like-to-like comparison with how things were over on Windows 11, because it does appear that this version of Windows will actually let us update the BIOS, and will actually update it properly without killing off CPU support. So now, I wouldn't be surprised if we went back to Windows 11, if we'd get even better performance, because now the processor is working properly. But it does actually mean that we are seeing as much as we can of the advantages of Windows 7. Now, I've tried to run as many modern titles as possible. Where I can't run the modern versions, I've run a replacement, or at least an age equivalent one that will run on the system, but at the end of the day, these are the limitations of Windows 7. Software support is getting very, very sketchy these days. Anyway, how does the £10 gaming PC, now running Windows 7, perform in the benchmarks? Starting things off with a nice and easy one, we have Half-Life 2, which is running the latest Steam version, which we were running with ultra settings in 1080p. Now, last time over on Windows 11 we were struggling to see a capped 60 FPS frame rate, but here on Windows 7, with a lot less overhead going on, and the correct BIOS running the correct clocks, we saw 145 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 96 FPS. Honestly, if you capped the frame rate at 60, I doubt it would ever move away from this figure, so this was already a nice increase in performance, even if it was in a title that the system was able to handle pretty much fine on Windows 11. We're just now seeing nearly 2 to 3 times the frame rate, with no problems and the same quality of visuals, which was pretty good to see, and all we've had to do is change operating system and do a few little tweaks here or there. Now, the latest release of BeamNG, I couldn't get it to work whatsoever. I spent about half an hour on it trying to make it run, but unfortunately it is just requiring too many files now, and just parts of Windows that don't exist on Windows 7. I'm sure someone could figure it out, but unfortunately, I just couldn't get it to run. Fortunately, the developers of BeamNG actually have common sense and actually a care for their community, and do provide the last confirmed working version of Windows 7 available on Steam just to download. Just 2 clicks and you've managed to get the version that will work on your operating system, so I commend them for this. And honestly, it's still quite an up-to-date version. With low and medium settings in 720p, we were now able to run the jungle map with 36 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 14 FPS. These 1% lows were primarily the fact that the system cannot deal with you driving into hedges or trees, because there's just so many draw calls going on that something's getting saturated. But at the end of the day, BeamNG now went from being something you could only play on simple maps to something you could now play in even the most intensive of maps with decent settings. Now, there was no way for me to get Mount & Blade Bannerlord, which I don't doubt would probably work absolutely fine on this system now, running on Windows 7. I tried a few workarounds, I tried a few tweaks, I tried modifying things, and I just couldn't get it to launch. So instead, as a substitute, we have Mount & Blade Vikings Conquest, running with ultra settings in 1080p. Now, I did have to limit the battle size to 150, as the Core 2 Quad begins to struggle. The graphics card was absolutely fine handling that many people on screen, but the processor really wasn't. So you could actually have some fairly decent sized battles, you just have to limit it to around the 100 to 150 range. We saw 55 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 36 FPS. It's worth keeping in mind that for a lot of the early game this would be well into the hundreds of FPS a second, and this was as close as I could get to a late game battle that the system would actually be able to handle. And you know what, at ultra settings, I mean, it didn't look good, but it didn't look as bad as it could have. just to step things up a notch, now that we actually have some RAM available on the system, I was wondering if it could run Black Mesa, which is a remarkably difficult Source Engine game to run, and because we can't really run Counter-Strike 2, I've noticed it does have very similar performance levels to CS2, so maybe this is a substitute. I mean, Counter-Strike 2 just won't work on the system full stop, we don't have SSE 4.1 or 4.2. Either way, very intensive Source game engine here, and medium and high settings in 720p in the most intensive part of the game, which is the Zen level, returned us 41 FPS on average. 1% lows were down to 31 FPS when there were lots of enemies present on screen because once again, the Core 2 quad was struggling in places. This system is very badly balanced with horrible PCIe bottlenecks, RAM bottlenecks, and single core performance bottlenecks, but still, even after all that, Black Mesa did look and run great. There was no running Fallout 4 on the system, as no matter what I tried, I couldn't get it to launch. I'm sure there are workarounds, but it does appear the latest Anniversary Edition, or whatever they have, the update was just as broken support on Windows 7, so you'd likely be able to run an older version of the game, just not the current up-to-date Steam version. So instead of that, we have Skyrim Special Edition, running with a mixture of medium and high settings in 720p. And this is the exact type of budget build system that would have ran this game great back in the day. With 35 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 31 FPS when lots was going on, it pretty much runs fine no matter what you're doing. When you're in smaller locations, inside houses, fewer smaller towns, inside caves, you'd see pretty much a locked 50 to 60 FPS, depending on what was actually going on screen. So Skyrim Special Edition, no problems there, and you can actually enjoy it with some rather decent settings. RimWorld here is an interesting one, as we were running the game with the default settings and the frame rate is taken from running the game with the 3x speed. Keep in mind this is just to put some extra load on the system, as RimWorld's version 1.6 has added some decent multi-threading, which means performance on the Core 2 quads has actually gone up from where it used to be, but still they are struggling for IPC, which is something that the tick rate of the game does need for certain things going on. So either way, you would actually see the game accelerate at 3x speed. It was actually speeding up the internal clock, but it would bring your frame rate down to around 28 FPS, with 1% lows down to 16 FPS. This isn't really a problem because you can pause the game or go to 1x speed or 2x speed, but at the end of the day, this is pretty decent performance. So RimWorld, pretty enjoyable, but you're probably better off sticking to smaller sizes and smaller colonies, otherwise performance is going to suffer. The Tomb Raider reboot, which is something that would actually be quite appropriate on a Core 2 quad system, does actually work pretty decent, and the Core 2 quad wasn't really our bottleneck here at all. It was probably something to do with how this entire system deals with the graphics card, because it should be able to run this game better than this, but I'll take the performance anyway. High settings with Tress effects enabled in 720p returned us 35 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 28 FPS. So honestly, pretty playable in a high definition resolution. A 30 FPS cap would probably be recommended if you actually wanted to play through a game like this, but it gives you an idea of how them sort of contemporary 2010s titles will run on the system. Locked 30 FPS, pretty much maxed out settings, not everything on Ultimate, but a few options like Tress effects enabled, and you're going to get a pretty good time. Even simpler titles like Counter-Strike Source did actually see a notable increase in performance. I know it's a game they were already seeing well over 100 FPS in before on Windows 11, but we were now seeing 194 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 155 FPS during rather large competitive and deathmatch lobbies. So it's worth pointing out that you can still play some very popular competitive shooters, as Counter-Strike Source is regularly in the Steam Top 100 games played. And you're not exactly struggling for a frame rate either. You also have plenty of CPU left over because this game only really touches 2 cores. So at the end of the day, Counter-Strike Source worked fine, and you did get better performance here on Windows 7. I do believe that is mostly probably due to the extra 500 MHz we've got on the processor now, but it could be Windows 7 as well. You know what's a game that just works, and works well? There's no DRM problems, it still launches on Windows 7, and it runs great. Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes defaulted to medium and high settings in 1080p, which initially at first I thought Well, that seems optimistic, given that a lot of the games of this era will require 720p in resolution. But apparently not. This worked absolutely fine with 42 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 36 FPS. At first the game did want a 30 FPS cap, but it was sticking to it so religiously that I thought, you know what, we'll disable it and see what the real world actual max performance is. And it turns out the game looks great, it runs fine, and there's no problems. So this is probably because of the Fox engine, which is the engine I believe the game uses, which works perfectly even on this era and cheapness of hardware. Now, I did spend a bit of time trying to get City Skylines to launch because really it should work on a system like this. The problem is once again the DRM and the launcher. And I did do a little bit of tweaking to try and work my way around it, and honestly this doesn't seem like the Rockstar option where they've been deliberately malicious and tried to stop attempts of getting it working. This just seems like genuine incompetence because the amount of errors it was throwing up just seemed like they've got a terribly put together launcher that must be hardly working on even modern operating systems, let alone ones that it was originally designed for. In fact, did City Skylines even have a launcher when it came out? I can't really remember. At the end of the day, I did run this on Windows 7 at some point, but it does appear that now it's simply too old. I'm sure if you managed to get a version of the game that didn't have the DRM though, it'd work fine. But instead we're running OpenTTD, so it works fine for older city builders. Think your SimCity 4 OpenTTDs. Well, it's really a city builder, but cities grow in it. And here we're running with the A-base pack on version 15, 1080p resolution, and didn't drop a single frame at all. So there's plenty of classic city building titles, just the latest and greatest, if you can still call it that, like City Skylines, will no longer work on Windows 7 natively. But the big one you've all been waiting for, can the system now run GTA 5 now that it's running Windows 7? Because last time over on Windows 11, it was a bit of a nightmare, lowest settings 720p and hardly 20 FPS. But here, after the 6 or 7 hours it took me to get it running, we can run the game with normal settings and a few of the options on high, like textures, shaders, and I think the post-processing enabled on high, with AMD CHS shadows in 720p for resolution at an average of 44 FPS. Now, it is worth noting that originally the game did decide to run in 1080p, but this was far too much for the system. I know the graphics card can handle it, but once again it's not in a modern PC, it's in this cheap Optiplex. So I will take this performance as it is remarkably controllable and remarkably playable. Going through towns and cities quite quickly would bring you down to the 30 FPS and just below it range. Unfortunately, Fraps wouldn't capture the frame rate on the screen, but it was recording an actual frame rate graph, so I do know the performance and when it was occurring. But yeah, at the end of the day, GTA 5 in its legacy form still works fine on Windows 7, and you know what? This was pretty solid performance that is around twice as good frame rate wise as it was on Windows 11, with better settings. So that is a clear and definitive win that Rockstar didn't want us to have. But there was a reason why we spent so long struggling, because we could have just found a version of the game without DRM and ran that. I wanted to test GTA Online. And the reason for this was entirely so we have a comparison point to the video we had last week, or a couple of weeks ago, whenever it was, the original video on this where it was hardly playable. And I have to admit, it is still hardly playable, and dropping settings will not fix this. So even if you go down to the very lowest of settings, you'll get a pretty similar experience where the 1% lows are so low, it's pretty much unplayable unless you're in a lobby with just 2 or 3 people. This was in a lobby with around 23 players, which is over the 16-player threshold for playability on older systems, and it wasn't great. It was just about controllable in places, but there'd be sudden spikes of input lag. But you know what? I'm taking this as a win anyway, because it was more controllable than it was on Windows 11, even if the frame rate and the frame times were downright terrible. And you know what? We did what Rockstar didn't want us to do. Have this game still running online on Windows 7. But finally, can it run Crysis? Well, with high settings and DirectX 10 in a 1080p resolution, we saw 37 FPS on average and mediocre frame times down to 22 FPS, that would take a time to stabilise after heavy action or much was going on. This does appear to be some sort of issue with the system, as our 1% lows pretty much remained exactly the same as they did on Windows 11, but here we did have a higher average frame rate, which did mean in simpler scenes and scenarios, the game would run better. It's also worth noting the game would stabilise its frame rate a lot quicker here on Windows 7, so that is an advantage to how the system was running, but this is a game that uses one core mostly, two cores at best, and we've got four of them that aren't clocked very high. So even just whacking a Core 2 Duo in the system would likely give you a better experience than what we're achieving here. Then again, this system's all a bit of a disaster, but at the end of the day, yes, it can run Crysis. So the overall performance here on Windows 7, and it is a bit of a tricky one because I have gone back in post to compare the performance against Windows 11, and it does appear that a lot of our increase in performance did come from actually the system being able to install the correct BIOS. But that isn't to say that the system was bad here, because the overall performance across every title was better on Windows 7. And that was mostly because it is just running less in the background. Now, Windows 11 does have phenomenal RAM management, but Windows 7 simply manages its RAM by simply not using any. Even in this fully updated form, our RAM usage was very, very low. So I have thrown up a graph to compare performance before and after, which took me a while to go back and do because I had to put Windows 11 back on the system. Either way, as you can see, Windows 7 was clearly the superior operating system for games that would run. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everything is perfect here. Do you know why? Well, because there's a lot of titles that simply will not work on Windows 7. So yes, for age-appropriate titles that will work, or games that have still got support and the developers care, like BeamNG, you're going to have no problems. For games after that, well, it could be a case of developing your own workarounds like I had to for GTA 5, following community fixes that could be anywhere from 2 to 5 years out of date and may or may not work, and you've got to remember, even Steam itself, well, on this system, yes, we had notorious problems of having to close Steam Web Helper, but even then, it is a completely unsupported platform on Windows 7 now, which means you're already on borrowed time to actually get around to actually still having games on the system. So it's a bit of a weird one because yes, Windows 7 was objectively better than Windows 11 for everything that worked, even going back and testing it before. But that doesn't change things. The fact that it's still very unsupported, for some people that might be part of the fun if this is a challenge. For those people that are actually looking at this as a viable option of, I am stuck in, I don't know, maybe a poorer country and this is my computer, should I run Windows 7? Well, yes you can, for a bit of extra performance, but you're going to have to deal with the workarounds that are there. You know, a lot of people that watch this channel aren't always from the West, and do watch this for tips and tricks for extra performance, so yes, there is extra performance to be found on Windows 7, but you're going to have to put in a lot of work to get it. Now, for a lot of software, you can go back to older versions. In my case, for some software like MSI Afterburner, I keep a version that I used on Windows 7 on hand from benchmarking back when we still used it on this channel but as an actual viable choice. But the thing is, newer versions will not install, even if you use workarounds. I'm sure there will be some people working on alternatives, and those probably do exist, but it does mean you will have to use a lot of older versions of software. Now, lots of those do still exist, so you can get your web browsers, you can get your older versions of OBS, you can get your older media players, and they will work fine still. So, to actually use Windows 7 software-wise, there's either workarounds you can do, there's kernel extensions, and there are alternatives. The one thing that did work here on Windows 7 was the AMD overlay recording thing, which is one of the buggiest pieces of software that I've ever had the misfortune of using. It's why I've always just gone with OBS for testing recording. But here, well, we were actually able to not only run GTA 5 on the system, but record it using AMD VCE's internal graphics card encoding using the built-in drivers, and it was, one, not just smooth, but two, worked exceptionally well. So that is another advantage of Windows 7. Some contemporary forms of software that have been carried across onto Windows 8, 10 and 11 may work better here. When it comes to newer software, questionable. Older software, you may actually be in for a good time like I was with this recording test. So there we have it, the £10 gaming PC now running Windows 7. And honestly, we needed to do this, to be honest, didn't we? Because now with the BIOS up to date, we've gained some extra free processor performance. I would like to say it's fixed a few bugs with PCI Express, but honestly, it hasn't really. I mean, most of the advantages have come from the extra increase in clock speed, so thank you Windows 7 for that. It has also been an eye-opener into how viable Windows 7 is, because a lot of this video has been revolving around, can we make Windows 7 run for our use cases still? So it's been a real interesting one. On a system like this, yes, there is extra performance to be had, it's quicker for day-to-day usage, not that it was too bad on Windows 11, keep in mind, and it does mean that you can run some older titles a lot better. Whether or not I'd recommend to use Windows 7, well, that's up to you. If you don't mind the tweaking, you don't mind working around problems and you enjoy things like that, or you're in a situation where you're desperate for extra performance on the Windows side because you're utilizing a PC that may be like this or worse, it's not a terrible idea. To be able to give my full conclusion though, we're going to have to wait for the next video, aren't we? And that means, well, we're going to have to run Linux on the system. So that means we've got Windows 11 ticked off, we've got Windows 7 ticked off, and it's about time we got Linux ticked off as well. So thank you all very much for watching. I know this video has been a mess of me just trying to deal with Windows 7's problems, but it's worth documenting, and it was quite interesting to do. Although it was frustrating and very annoying, and lots of almost hair pulling was occurring at certain stages where we were this close, and then it would crash or something would go wrong. Doesn't matter. We got it done. Thank you all very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and good night.